What's it like to be the object of scorn and anger from the current American president? The object of death threats from his supporters? And more to the point, what's it like to try to hold Donald Trump to account in the storied tradition of the U.S. press corps? Few people are better placed to comment on that than Jim Acosta. He is CNN's chief White House correspondent. As such, he's tangled directly with the 45th president and has now put some of his thoughts on paper in a new book. It's called The Enemy of the People, A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth in America. And Jim Acosta joins us now on the line from his nation's capital. And Jim, we're glad you could spare some time for us on TVO tonight. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Not at all. You have been covering this White House since 2012, actually, so it gives you some sense about how this president handles things compared to the previous one. Can you make some comparing and contrasting notes for us now?
Well, that is a large subject to tackle, but I'll do my best to keep it as tight as I can. Listen, I covered the second term of Barack Obama. As I like to say from time to time, second terms can be complicated for American presidents. They don't always go smoothly. And we saw that with Barack Obama. He was dealing with a scandal in the Veterans Administration. He was dealing with the spread of ISIS, his national health care effort. Obamacare had problems where the Obamacare website didn't work. And so it was a difficult time for Barack Obama. And tough questions were asked. I asked the president tough questions from time to time when Barack Obama was in office. We all did. I think one of the big differences between then and now is that I think Barack Obama had a healthy respect for the job of the White House press corps, of the press here in the United States. And I hate to say it, I take no joy in saying this, but I don't think the same could be said of our current president, Donald Trump. As we saw during the campaign, this was long before he called us fake news and the enemy of the people. Then candidate Trump referred to the press as the dishonest news media, the disgusting news media, liars, scum, and so on. And then he rolled that act into the Oval Office, started off by calling us fake news, called me fake news at that infamous press conference in January 2017, and then the enemy of the people. And I think, and as I write about in this book, what started off as kind of an act or a shtick from his reality TV days has gotten out of control. And the rhetoric has gotten to a point where some of the hostility is absorbed by his supporters, not all of his supporters, some of his supporters, and then directed back at us in ways that make us feel threatened. And I think that is what has been picked up on here in the United States and around the world, that this is a very difficult and somewhat dangerous time for the press in covering this administration, because this is really nothing like we've ever seen before.
I do want to follow up on one thing you said there, because in your book you tell the story about how the president said to one of his press attachés, "Jim gets it," meaning he seemed to think that you were in on, quote unquote, some act that the two of you would be performing for the American people. What did you take from that?
Right. I mean, this, I'm glad you brought this up. This happened after the February 2017 press conference. The president called me very fake news. And after the press conference was over, I got a call from one of his top aides, Hope Hicks. And she said to me on the phone, she said, "Jim, I just want you to know the president thought you were very professional today and said Jim gets it." And I thought to myself, wait a minute. The president just referred to me as very fake news 5 minutes ago, and now he's saying I'm professional and I get it. I don't know what's going on here. Am I in the twilight zone? And I talked to a number of his aides, and they basically explained, "Jim, this is an act. He doesn't really mean it," and so on. There are lots of ways to parse this. First, I'm not in on the act. We're not a part of some reality TV show, contrived melodrama that he's trying to put out there to prop up his political prospects. We're here to do the news. We're here to report on his administration. The second thing is, and I write about this a great deal in my book, and I think it's something that people need to think deeply about, not everybody is in on the act. And so when the president refers to us as the enemy of the people, there are some of his supporters who take that very seriously. Keep in mind, and we can talk about this, the man who sent the pipe bombs to CNN in 3 different locations, New York, Washington, and Atlanta. Those were real bombs. When he was caught, he had been directing death threats at me on Twitter. And some of those things that he was saying on Twitter were, "You're the enemy of America. You're next." He was essentially following his role model, Donald Trump, in going after us and talking about us in ways that the president was talking about us. And so these are dangerous things to be getting involved in when the president of the United States demonizes the press. And I think we saw that play out with the pipe bomb incident. He is a role model for his supporters, and sometimes I think he loses sight of that.
Before we get deeper into this conversation, let's go back to about a year from now. Here's you at work doing your thing. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll the clip.
They're hundreds of miles away, though. They're hundreds and hundreds of miles away. That's not an invasion.
Honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings would be much better.
If I may ask one other question, Mr. President, if I may ask
Peter,
one other
go ahead.
question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President,
That's
I was
enough.
going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr.
Excuse
President,
me. That's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other
Peter,
question,
let's
if
go.
I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have
I'm not concerned
indictments-
about anything with
that you
the
may have
Russian
indictments coming down?
investigation because it's a hoax.
Are you-
That's enough. Put down the mic.
Mr. President, are you worried about indictments coming down in this investigation?
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN.
I want to know what's going on in your head as that's happening.
Well, I'm just trying to get my question out, and I write about this in the book. There are a couple of sections in the book where I include the transcript of the exchanges between me and the president, and I don't do that to bore the reader or put anybody to sleep. I do that because, folks need to see, the first 5 or 6 words coming out of your mouth. After that, the president's already interrupting you, he's berating you, he's insulting you. And, I think, one of the things that you're trying to do in that moment is just get the question across. And as I describe it to people all the time when I talk to them, I describe it as a question of what would you do? Do you sit there like a potted plant and absorb this abuse? Or do you try to stand up for yourself and get your question across? We're not here to be a stenographer. We're not here to do the news the way the president likes or his supporters like over on conservative media. We're here to do the news for everybody, and that means the president has to answer our questions. If he calls on us, he should have the reasonable expectation that a tough question might get asked. Unfortunately, what we saw in that incident is the president was already in a very bad mood. He had just lost in the midterms. The House of Representatives was going to go over to the Democrats. This meant a lot of problems were on the horizon for this president. Some of the things that we're seeing right now playing out here in Washington with this impeachment inquiry. And I suppose some of those things were swirling around in his head at that time, and he was very upset about it. It was very unfortunate that somebody came over and tried to take my microphone away. The thought that I had at the time was, oh my goodness, I've never had this happen before. You can see me sort of pulling back and saying, pardon me, ma'am, because I'd never experienced anything like this before. So, in some ways, it's just another day at the office covering Donald Trump. It is a surreal experience that feels like it's, out of Alice in Wonderland or 1984. But you just have to continue to keep pushing, keep driving, keep charging, and do your job. And that's what I was trying to do in that moment.
In a way, it's a perfect Rorschach test for what's going on in your country right now, because, of course, many people saw that as you being argumentative, you being rude to the person who was trying to take the microphone away, the intern, and they saw you as being the bad guy in the whole drama. Did that notion ever occur to you that maybe I've overstepped here?
Well, I know my friends in Canada are very polite, and so perhaps there are going to be some folks on your side of the border who may take issue with what I did. My sense of it is that the president of the United States should not be berating and insulting and attacking reporters. The sense of decorum that we should have in the White House, that is a two-way street. And what would the message have been had I allowed the president to just beat up on me that day and allowed the intern to rip away my microphone? What would have been the conversation after all of that? My sense of it is that there are some folks out there here in the United States who are watching all of this play out, who want to see the reporters stand up for themselves and stand their ground when they're in a situation like that. I wasn't trying to perform for the cameras or, get more Twitter followers or anything like that. I was just trying to do my job. And my sense of it is that, when we look at this period 5, 10, 15 years from now, yes, that video is not going to look all that great, I suppose, down the road. It will always be sort of an intense thing to look at. But I hope that, some of the viewers out there will take away from that episode that reporters need to be able to do their jobs, and they should be able to do their jobs without being attacked by the leader of the free world. by the most powerful person in the world. What kind of message are we sending to our kids here in the United States and other countries that care about democracy when the president behaves in that way? If I had to do it all over again, I think I would do it the exact same way. We have to stand up for ourselves and stand our ground when we're being attacked.
I'm sure you've heard this before, but let me get your take on it anyway. CNN gave a great deal of what you might call, free coverage to candidate Trump before he became President Trump, because he was such a draw. He was like that train wreck that you couldn't look away from. It was many of his public events were just unprecedented in the way he was running for president. They say you helped make him president. Now you're complaining about the kind of president that any fortune teller could tell you he was just going to be. You've made your bed, now you've got to sleep in it. What's your view on that?
Well, I think it's a valid point. It's a valid criticism. As I write in the book, there were a lot of people who thought when Donald Trump became president, the conventional wisdom here in Washington was that the majesty of the presidency would rest upon his shoulders and suddenly transform him into the next Ronald Reagan or something like that. I didn't think that was going to happen based on my experience covering him during the campaign. And, listen, I can't sit here and explain the editorial or coverage decisions by CNN or any other news organization. I will tell you, when I was out there on the campaign trail covering Donald Trump in 2016, I noticed a number of news organizations were all giving Donald Trump the same kind of coverage. You could look at the main page of the New York Times or the Washington Post or any major newspaper, and you could say, well, there's a story on Donald Trump, and there's a story on Donald Trump on their main page on a daily basis. And so I think all of the news media were covering this phenomenon the way I think it should have been covered at the time. Keep in mind, from the very beginning of his campaign, when he announced he was running for president in June of 2015, when he referred to Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals, he was the GOP frontrunner. And one of the things that I tell folks when I get asked this question is, how are we supposed to not cover the GOP frontrunner as anything but the GOP frontrunner? We have to cover the election as it's developing. Candidates who are in the lead are obviously going to get more coverage than the candidates who are at the back of the pack. That's how we do things here in the United States. And throughout the entire process, he essentially remained that frontrunner. When he announced that he was going to call for a Muslim ban as president of the United States, when he said that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it, that did not affect his standing in the polls. And so as journalists, what are you supposed to do at that point? Are news organizations supposed to make an editorial judgment that this person is bad for the country or bad for democracy and then pull the plug on the coverage? I don't think so. We have to continue to cover things the way they're developing out on the campaign trail. One other point that should be made is, remember, the news media did not go to Hillary Clinton's campaign and say, oh, by the way, we don't think you should campaign in Wisconsin. We don't think you should campaign in Michigan. Those were decisions that the Clinton campaign made, and I think they have to recognize that there was that aspect of the campaign that was developing as well, that Donald Trump in many ways, and I saw this out on the campaign trail, was outworking and out-campaigning Hillary Clinton for a large chunk of that general election cycle. One other final thing, the other component of this imperfect storm that developed in 2016, the Comey letter, the letter from the FBI director at the time, James Comey, saying he was going to reopen the Hillary Clinton email investigation 11 days before the general election in the United States in 2016, that fundamentally changed the race at a very critical juncture. I mean, you could sense it out on the campaign trail that the momentum for Hillary Clinton had come to a screeching halt and was beginning to move in Donald Trump's direction in the final 11 days of that campaign. So, for folks at home, I understand the frustration who say, oh, well, CNN did this or the news networks did this. I think that's, respectfully, I would say to my friends in Canada, that is a bit of a two-dimensional view as to what happened in the 2016 campaign. There were other forces at play.
No, all fair points, of course. And I should say, parenthetically, I read your book. I enjoyed it very much. And but you as a journalist, you'll understand that part of my job here is to obviously bring criticisms that I've heard of you and of CNN to you and get you to comment on them. Yeah. And to that end, one of the things that I hear frequently is that American reporters, they don't just talk about you, they talk about many people who cover the White House. Sure. American reporters have stopped reporting and they have started opining. And to that end, I want to read a little excerpt from your book and then get you to opine on the excerpt. Here we go. Most Republicans outside the administration, you write, nearly united in their cowardice, stood firm in their refusal to confront the president. This sad chapter only reinforced the recognition that the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, had become Trump's latest real estate acquisition. Now, again, those sound like the words of a columnist as opposed to a reporter. Do you want to help us distinguish here between what you're trying to do in that circumstance?
Well, listen, I think one of the things that we have to do as journalists, and, we're not referees in a football game, we're journalists. And, part of what we're here to do is not just report the news, but defend the truth. And take, for example, the president's tendency to be very dishonest with the American people. The Washington Post has determined over the last couple of years of this administration, since Donald Trump came into office, that he's uttered some 13,000 false or misleading statements since coming into office. Now, are we supposed to just let those falsehoods, half-truths, lies, are we supposed to let those stand without being challenged or corrected? No. We have to correct the record. We have to stand up for the truth. Same goes for what has happened over the last couple of years. What has happened over the last couple of years? We've seen the president time and time again use the kind of language that is not becoming of a president of the United States, and the Republican Party has largely sat on the sidelines and not really challenged that. I think that has to be called out. One of the things that I bring up in the book, and you'll recall this because thank you for reading it, Walter Cronkite of CBS News, the legendary CBS newsman, he was once referred to as the most trusted man in America. One of the things that Walter Cronkite did during the Vietnam War was he was watching these battlefield reports come in from his correspondents, and he said, you know what, this is serious enough where I need to go over there and take a pulse of what's happening over in Vietnam. Walter Cronkite came back and said, the war in Vietnam cannot be won. It's likely going to end in a stalemate. And Lyndon Johnson famously said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost middle America. Now, was Walter Cronkite supposed to go over to Vietnam and come back and say, well, on the one hand, things aren't going very well in Vietnam, but on the other hand, maybe the United States can pull things out? No. Walter Cronkite made an observation based on his reporting, and as uncomfortable and as difficult as it sounded to the American people, it was a necessary thing to do. And I think when it comes to the situation in Charlottesville, where the president said that there were very fine people on both sides. When it comes to dealing with white supremacist violence in a major American city, the President of the United States needs to get that right the first time. That didn't happen in Charlottesville. When it comes to the President's performance in Helsinki, the Helsinki summit with Vladimir Putin, he took the word over the Russian president over his own intelligence community when it comes to Russian meddling in the 2016 election. What was the United States press corps supposed to do at that point? Was it supposed to say, well, on the one hand, Donald Trump did okay out there, but on the other hand, maybe he could have had a better day? No. What you saw from the United States press corps, and my colleague Anderson Cooper, I think, hit the nail on the head, that it was a disgraceful moment for the President of the United States. Are we supposed to pull our punches because people on the right beat us up for telling the American people the truth? No. So, yes, I mean, I get it that it is uncomfortable to watch at times, and perhaps there are folks at home who don't like what we have to say, but our job as journalists is to give the American people not just the news, but the truth, and the hard truths, and the ugly truths. And I can't imagine us doing it any other way, especially right now with what's happening in this country.
No, I say frequently on this program that what we deal in the world of empirically provable facts here, and I think it's an empirically provable fact that this president has prevaricated more than any other in our lifetimes.
Right.
I do
but
want to
even
get
there,
your,
if you don't mind me interrupting,
Yeah.
even there you choose the word prevaricated.
Well, that's what I wanted to pick up on, Jim.
Canadians are a very polite bunch, and that's what I love about you. But
can I pick up on that? Let me pick up on that.
Well, I was going to say we get slammed here in the United States for not using the word lie. There are folks on the left who say, why don't you use the word lie? And so we're getting hit from all sides, and it is a tricky balancing act. But please, I'll let you get back to your question.
Well, no, you've actually, I mean, that's exactly where I wanted to go. I still feel very uncomfortable calling anybody a liar, even when I know that they are lying. But right. I wonder, can you go through the thought process that you went through before, because we do use all sorts of synonyms besides saying the word liar to describe what comes out of the president's mouth. How and
Right.
when did you come to the conclusion that, yes, he knowingly put out false information, and therefore I'm on solid ground to call him a liar?
And again, I don't do it every time. By and large, I don't do it. On many of my pieces that we air on the Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer, for example, I'll say, but that's not true. But that's not true. The president said this, but that's not true. And we don't say he's a liar. It is a very difficult thing. But I think when you've gotten to the point where you've said approximately 13,000 false or misleading things since coming into office, that on occasion you are lying, and that makes you a liar. And I hate to say that because I wasn't raised to just go around calling people liars, and it is a difficult thing. But this is part of the challenge in covering this administration and covering this president. It's hard to stay in your lane as a straight news reporter when the president of the United States is running you off the road. And one of the things that we're dealing with on a daily basis is that there's almost a fire hose of falsehoods being aimed in our faces. And so, again, we get back to that question of what would you do? Do you say, do you just let these things be aired unchallenged without correcting the record? Or do you occasionally have to point out, listen, this was a falsehood, and this is a falsehood that he has said so many times, and the record has been corrected so many times, he must be aware that it's a lie. I'll give you one example. When the president tweeted that the reason why he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton is because millions of undocumented immigrants voted in the 2016 election, there is no basis for that. There are no studies to prove that. That is something that he's pulled out of thin air, essentially. That is a lie. When you say that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States and you perpetuate that false myth, you are trafficking in lies. And the president was rewarded with the keys to the Oval Office for all of that. That's an uncomfortable thing. But I don't think we serve ourselves very well by sticking our heads in the sand or tiptoeing through the tulips. We can't whistle past the graveyard when it comes to our democracy. We have to call things as we see them. And I think one of the things that perhaps might be a silver lining in all of this is that this exercise that we're going through right now, and sometimes a painful exercise, it is forcing us to confront what we need to do as journalists and as citizens who care about democratic freedoms, not just here in the United States, but in much of the Western world. You're seeing a challenge to democracy crop up across Western Europe. It's popping up in countries across Western Europe where you see these ultra-nationalist and ultra-conservative movements cropping up. What are you supposed to do when some of those movements demonize immigrants or peddle falsehoods? I think if we care about the way of life that we have right now in these countries, we've got to get tough, and we've got to make sure that lies are called lies and falsehoods are corrected. And if those elected leaders don't, want to stick to the truth, then they need to be called out for it.
Well, since you brought up international relations, let me follow up with a question on that, because while I don't speak for 36 million Canadians, I think I'm on pretty solid ground on saying that millions of Canadians were truly offended when, the country that they think of often as their best friend in the world, the United States, labeled Canada a national security threat and put tariffs on our steel and so on. And I think it was Peter Navarro who said that there's a special place in hell for Justin Trudeau. And even if you're not a fan of the Prime Minister, that felt like overheated rhetoric. Can you please explain to our viewers how it's possible that this president really has quite nasty things to say about his allies like Justin Trudeau and Angela Merkel, and he seems to be best pals with Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un?
It is a strange, surreal thing. I reported on some of this. We broke a story on this particular story last year when we reported that Donald Trump, in trying to justify these tariffs on Canadian imports and using the national security justification for doing so, once said to the Prime Minister, "Didn't you guys burn down the White House?" And that was something that, of course, reverberated here in the United States, but also up in Canada. It is a peculiar thing that the president has fought so much with his allies and longstanding U.S. allies and partners, and has cozied up to the likes of Vladimir Putin, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Xi Jinping in China, and as you mentioned, Kim Jong-un. It is an odd thing, and I asked the president about this at the G20 summit in Osaka, Japan last summer. Why is it that you seem to cozy up to these dictators? It was obviously a question that he didn't like. It's pretty much, I think, the last question he took from me at a formal news conference. But listen, these are questions that need to be asked, and I will tell you, it's interesting that we're getting to this discussion right now here in the U.S., here in Washington, about the Ukraine investigation and what was said between the President of the United States and President Zelensky of Ukraine. I was alerted to this problem, and I wrote about this in my book, that there are national security officials inside the administration who have been alarmed by the president's behavior and some of these foreign leader phone calls and some of his interactions with the likes of Vladimir Putin. I had one national security official, and I wrote about this in the book, who said to me, I can't tell you whether or not that the president is advancing U.S. interests in these interactions with the foreign leaders. So, that was a sneak preview of coming attractions as far as I'm concerned, because we're now seeing a lot of this play out right now, where the president's behavior in conducting himself with some of these foreign leaders, like the leader of Ukraine, now that all of this is being called into question, and whether or not the president was, in fact, trying to engage in a quid pro quo to dig up dirt on former Vice President Joe Biden. His presidency now hangs in the balance because of those actions. And so I think, these are all very legitimate questions to ask, but I will tell you, it is a very strange and surreal thing to see the president conduct himself in this fashion. But, that one of the things I get asked from time to time is, Jim, what are you going to do next? How can you continue to live your life in this way? Covering this president must be exhausting. I would like to see how this movie ends, because, the way that the president has conducted himself, to me, only leads to one conclusion, and that is his presidency not ending very well. And so I think we need to see how all of this plays out. But certainly, up until this point, the way he's conducted himself with these foreign leaders, it raises a lot of questions.
Let me just beg the control room for one more minute, because I do want to ask you one last thing. I really want to try to better understand the kind of special sauce that Donald Trump appears to have over the American polity at the moment. And you tell a story in your book about Orrin Hatch, who's a senator from Utah, and I guess he's in his 80s now. He's seen a lot of presidents come and go. As a result, he should have some pretty good historical perspective on what makes for a good president. He called Donald Trump the greatest president ever. And I'm trying to understand what it is about Trump that makes otherwise sensible people crumble in his presence. What's he got?
Yeah. Well, it is perhaps one of the questions of our time, and I think one of the things that we're going to see here in the coming weeks in this Ukraine investigation and in the impeachment inquiry is, are we going to see what John F. Kennedy referred to as a profile in courage? And this is a question right now for the Republican Party here in the United States. Will one of these Republican senators over in the Senate, if the president is impeached in the House, and this question comes over to the Senate and they have to conduct a trial in the Senate, will one of these Republican senators stand up in a moment of major importance and say that the president should not be conducting himself and trying to get dirt on his political opponents with the help of foreign actors? I think that is one of the key questions that we will see now play out here in the coming months. I think one of the things that the president has done in a very crafty way with the Republican Party, he has sort of, figured out their pressure points and their sensitive spots. He has figured out that they will stomach a great deal in terms of his behavior and what he's done in the past and what he tweets if he gives them conservative judges and tax cuts and so on. So, there's been a lot of horse trading going on inside the Republican Party in that regard. But we're now about to find out what happens when you engage in that kind of devil's bargain. What becomes of it at the end? And not to disparage Orrin Hatch in any way. He was a very well-respected senator here in Washington, but I think his comments on that day when the tax cuts were signed into law and celebrated on the South Lawn of the White House, it's illustrative of that point, and that is a lot of Republicans have decided for themselves that they're no longer the party of Ronald Reagan and Dwight Eisenhower and Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. They are the party of President Trump. They are the party of Donald Trump. And we're now about to find out in real time, in living color, what that delivers onto the American people at the end of all of this. My sense of it is in 5, 10, 15 years from now, when we look back on this period in our history, there's going to be a lot of regrets, and not just on the Republican side, but for everybody. Because you can't have a president of the United States conduct himself calling the press the enemy of the people, demonizing immigrants, cozying up to dictators and the likes of Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, and at the end of the day, everything works out just fine and dandy. My sense of history, and that's what I try to talk about in this book, is that all of us here in the United States and our neighbors in Canada and our friends around the world, we have to think deeply about the kind of political culture that we want to hand off to the next generation. Is this the kind of way of life that we want for the next generation, not just here in the U.S., but around the world? My sense of it is, having looked at what we've been going through these last few years, is that we've got a lot of deep thinking to do as we move forward.
Well, the next part of this movie is a year from next Tuesday, because that's when your next election is. And we will happily remind people that, Jim, your book is called The Enemy of the People, A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth in America, and it has brought Chief White House Correspondent for CNN, Jim Acosta, to our airwaves tonight. And for that, we're grateful. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks so much. Great being with you. Appreciate it.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.